Rain had not fallen on the slums of Varith in 3 months, so when fire fell from the sky instead, people thought it was a sign from the old gods the kingdom had long stopped worshipping. It came down fast, cutting a bright orange line through the clouds, roaring louder than any ship engine. The noise shook the tin roofs of the poor district and rattled the loose bones of buildings that had been patched together for generations. Dogs barked. Children screamed. And then it hit the ground with a force that knocked people off their feet nearly a mile away. Tomas Reed was one of the few who did not run toward the noise out of fear, and not one of the many who ran toward it out of curiosity either. He ran toward it because it had landed close to his shack, and if something valuable had just fallen from the sky, he needed to reach it before anyone else did. That was how he had survived for the last 10 years, moving faster than hunger, faster than debt, faster than the guards who came to collect taxes from people who had nothing left to give. He was thin in the way that comes from skipping meals, not from choice. His clothes were patched more times than they were original cloth. He carried an old metal hook, the kind used to drag scrap out of collapsed buildings, because it was the only tool he owned that could double as a weapon if it came to that. As he ran through the narrow paths between the shacks, past sleepy eyes peeking through broken shutters, he did not know that his life was about to change forever. He only knew that something big had crashed, and big things sometimes meant enough metal to eat for a month. When he reached the crash site, the smoke was still rising in thick gray columns. The heat from it pressed against his face like an open oven. At first he thought it was a ship, one of the noble transport vessels that sometimes fell out of the sky when their old engines failed. But ships did not have scales. Ships did not breathe. Lying in a crater of broken earth was a dragon, larger than any building in the slums, larger than the palace towers Tomas had only ever seen from a distance. Its scales, dark green fading to black, were cracked and bleeding in several places. One wing was bent at an angle that made Tomas wince just from looking at it. Smoke curled from wounds that looked like they had been carved by something with terrible strength. The creature's chest rose and fell in slow, ragged movements, each breath sounding like a dying engine trying to restart one more time. Tomas had heard stories about dragons his whole life. Everyone had. They were the pride of the nobility, bonded companions given only to those of noble blood, capable of flight between worlds and feats no machine could match. He had never expected to see one this close, and certainly never expected to see one broken and alone, abandoned in the poorest part of the kingdom where no noble would ever set foot. He should have run. Every instinct told him that approaching a wounded dragon was a good way to end up as a stain on the ground. But something about the way it was breathing, so slow, so exhausted, so much like the way his own mother had breathed in her final days when the healers refused to treat someone who could not pay, made him stop thinking about danger and start thinking about the animal's pain. He walked closer, step by careful step, his hook lowered to his side. The dragon's eye, large as a wagon wheel, opened halfway and fixed on him. Tomas froze. He expected fire. He expected to be turned to ash in an instant. Instead, the eye simply watched him, tired and searching, as if trying to understand why a human was walking toward it instead of away. "I'm not here to hurt you," Tomas said quietly, though he had no idea if the creature understood words at all. His voice cracked from thirst and fear. "I don't have anything that could hurt you anyway." He knelt beside one of the smaller wounds on the dragon's foreleg, a gash that was still bleeding steadily. Without thinking too hard about it, he tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and pressed it against the wound, applying pressure the way he had once seen a healer do for a construction worker who had been crushed under falling stone. The dragon flinched but did not pull away. Behind him, in the distance, he could hear the sound of engines. The nobility's guards, alerted by the crash, were finally on their way, likely hoping to claim whatever treasure had fallen from the heavens. Tomas knew he had only minutes before they arrived and pushed him aside like they always did. He kept working anyway. He tore more cloth. He found a broken piece of wood to use as a splint for the bent wing, wedging it carefully despite the size difference between his hands and the injury. He talked to the dragon the whole time, not because he expected a response, but because it seemed to calm the creature, and it calmed him too. He told it about his mother, about the years of scavenging, about how nobody in the kingdom had ever looked at him the way this dying animal was looking at him now, like he mattered. The dragon's breathing slowed, not from dying, but from something closer to relief. Its enormous eye stayed locked on him even as exhaustion pulled at its body. Then, just as the first guard ships broke through the smoke overhead, a warm golden light began to spread from the dragon's chest, wrapping around Tomas like a second skin he never asked for. He felt heat, not painful, but deep, sinking into his bones, into his chest, into something he could not name. The dragon's eye closed, not in death, but in peace, and a voice that was not quite a voice, more like a feeling given shape, whispered into the back of his mind. Chosen. The guards landed moments later, weapons raised, shouting orders for him to step away from the beast immediately. But it was already too late. The bond had formed, and nothing they did next would be able to undo it. Word travels faster than fire in a kingdom built on gossip and pride, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, every noble house in Varith had already heard some version of the story, each one more twisted than the last. A dragon had fallen from the sky. A dragon had bonded with a human. Worse still, a dragon had bonded with the poorest human in the entire kingdom, a nobody from the slums who owned nothing but a rusted hook and a pile of debts. In the Grand Council Hall, built from white stone that never seemed to gather dust despite centuries of use, the ruling elders of Varith argued louder than they had in years. Lord Havend, an older noble with silver markings across his face that signified generations of dragon-bonded ancestors, slammed his hand against the marble table hard enough to crack it. "This is not possible," he said, his voice shaking with something between fury and disbelief. "The Ashcrown dragon has not bonded with anyone in 300 years. She was meant for someone worthy, someone trained, not some beggar who probably cannot even read." Around the table, other nobles nodded in agreement, their faces twisted with the particular kind of anger that comes from watching something you believe you deserve be given to someone else instead. Several of their own children had trained for years, sometimes since birth, preparing for the day a dragon might choose them. To see that honor handed to a stranger from the slums felt, to them, like a personal insult from the universe itself. "The bond cannot be reversed," said an older woman near the end of the table, her voice calm but firm. She was one of the few dragon-kin scholars left in the kingdom, someone who studied the old ways when most nobles preferred to simply enjoy the privileges those old ways provided. Once formed, it is permanent. If we try to force it apart, we risk killing them both, or worse, provoking the dragon into destroying half the capital. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Nobody liked being told they could not simply undo something inconvenient. In Varith, power usually meant the ability to erase problems, not live with them. "Then we deal with the human," Lord Havend said finally, his tone cold. Quietly, if possible. Tomas, meanwhile, had spent the night in a holding cell beneath the palace, dragged there by guards who seemed more confused than aggressive, unsure of how to treat someone who was technically now bonded to one of the most powerful creatures in the kingdom, yet still looked like he belonged in a gutter. His hands were tied loosely, more out of habit than necessity, since nobody quite knew what would happen if they tried to hurt him while the dragon slept just beyond the palace walls, healing under heavy guard. He had not slept. His mind kept replaying the moment the golden light wrapped around him, that strange word echoing in his skull. Chosen. He did not understand it. He did not feel chosen. He felt like exactly what he had always been, someone caught in the gears of a system that was never built for people like him. When the guards finally came to bring him before the council, they did not bother explaining anything. They simply dragged him up flights of stairs so polished he could see his own tired reflection in them, through hallways lined with portraits of noble dragon riders staring down at him with painted contempt, until he was shoved into the center of the Grand Council Hall. The room was worse than he expected. Dozens of nobles in silk robes and jeweled armor stared down at him from raised platforms, their expressions ranging from disgust to amusement, as if his very existence in their sacred hall was some kind of joke being played on all of them. "You," Lord Havend said, standing and pointing a long finger toward Tomas. "Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand the honor you have stolen?" Tomas looked up at him, exhausted, hungry, and far too tired to be afraid in the way they wanted him to be. "I didn't steal anything," he said, his voice rough but steady. "She was dying. Nobody else came to help her. I did." A few nobles scoffed. One laughed outright. You expect us to believe a beggar acted out of kindness? Haven't sneered. You saw an opportunity, and you took it. If I wanted an opportunity, Tomas said, I would have taken the metal from her wings and sold it before your guards even arrived. I didn't. I helped because she was hurting, and I know what it feels like to be hurting with nobody around who cares. The hall went quiet. It was not the answer they expected, not the groveling apology or the desperate excuse they had prepared themselves to tear apart. Tomas was not trying to defend himself with clever words. He was simply telling the truth, plainly, without fear of what it might cost him, because he had spent his whole life with very little left to lose. Lord Haven's face darkened. He opened his mouth to respond, likely with another threat, when the entire hall shook. Dust drifted down from the high ceilings. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a deep, rolling roar echoed through the capital, powerful enough to rattle the windows in their frames. The scholar at the end of the table went pale. She's awake, she said quietly, and she knows he is here. The roar came again, closer this time, and even the proudest nobles in the room flinched. Whatever plans Lord Haven had been forming to quietly remove the problem sitting in front of him were suddenly a great deal more complicated. The ash-crowned dragon had chosen her rider, and it was becoming very clear, very quickly, that she had no intention of letting anyone take him away. The sanctuary where wounded dragons were kept looked nothing like the slums Tomas had grown up in, and for the first 2 days, he found himself flinching at things that should not have scared him at all. Soft beds felt strange under his back, like they might swallow him whole. Warm food arriving 3 times a day made his stomach twist with suspicion, waiting for someone to snatch it away and tell him it had all been a cruel joke. He kept expecting guards to burst in and announce it was over, that the bond had been a mistake, that he was being sent back to the gutter where he belonged. Nobody came. Instead, every morning, healers arrived to check on the dragon, and every morning, they found Tomas already awake, sitting beside her, talking quietly about nothing important, the way people talk to keep themselves from feeling alone. He had not given her a grand name. The nobles who oversaw the sanctuary had expected something dramatic, something worthy of a creature of her power, but Tomas simply started calling her Rill, after a small stream that used to run near his childhood home before the kingdom dammed it up to supply water to the noble districts instead. It was the only thing from his old life he remembered as gentle, and it felt right for a creature who had been anything but gentle to the world, yet somehow gentle with him. Rill did not speak in words most of the time. Her communication came in flashes of feeling, brief images pressed into his mind, sensations more than sentences. It took him days to understand the difference between her hunger and her curiosity, her pain and her impatience. But slowly, piece by piece, a kind of understanding grew between them that had nothing to do with training or ritual, only time and attention. One evening, as Rain finally returned to the kingdom for the first time in months, Tomas sat beside her healing wing, running his hand along a patch of scales that had begun to knit itself back together. A memory pushed itself into his mind, not his own. He saw a different young man, dressed in ragged clothes not unlike his own, sitting beside a smaller version of Rill centuries ago, laughing as she nudged him playfully into a river. That's not me, Tomas said aloud, startled. Rill's massive head shifted slightly, and another feeling rose in his chest, something like grief mixed with warmth. He understood, without being told directly, that she had bonded with a human before, long before the kingdom decided such bonds were beneath their dignity, long before history books stopped mentioning it entirely. They erased that, Tomas whispered, more to himself than to her. They erased all of it. He began spending his free hours in the sanctuary's small library, a room mostly ignored by the nobles who visited only to admire their dragons, not study them. The books were old, filled with dust, and the particular smell of pages nobody had turned in decades. Most of what he found was useless to him, technical manuals about dragon anatomy and feeding schedules. But buried in the oldest section, tucked behind newer texts clearly meant to replace it, he found fragments of an older history. According to these older texts, dragons and humans had once shared a much closer relationship, long before Veritha's current ruling species rose to power. Some of the oldest bonded pairs recorded in history were humans, not nobles of noble blood, but ordinary people, farmers and workers, and even beggars, chosen not for status, but for something the text vaguely described as unbroken will. Tomas did not fully understand what that meant yet, but something about the phrase settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he knew about why Ril had chosen him. Meanwhile, outside the sanctuary walls, the kingdom's nobility watched his progress with growing discomfort. They had expected him to fail, to embarrass himself, to prove through his ignorance that dragons were simply mistaken about worth, that bloodline mattered more than whatever nonsense sentiment had caused Ril's crash-addled mind to choose him. Instead, reports reached the council describing a bond growing stronger by the day, a dragon healing faster than any physician expected, and a human who adapted to sanctuary life with a kind of quiet resilience that unsettled everyone who witnessed it. He did not throw tantrums when things confused him. He did not demand servants or luxury. He simply learned, the way people learn who have spent their whole lives having to figure things out with no one there to help them. Lord Havant, informed of this progress during a private council meeting, slammed his hand on the table once again, though with far less confidence than before. He is playing a long game, Havant insisted to the other elders. No beggar adjusts this quickly without ulterior motive. The old scholar, the one who had first warned the council that the bond could not be undone, simply shook her head. Or perhaps, she said quietly, he adjusts quickly because his entire life has been nothing but adjusting to circumstances designed to break him. Perhaps survival is a skill your children never had to learn. Nobody in the room had a response to that. And far below the palace, in the healing sanctuary where rain tapped gently against the windows, Tomas sat beside Ril, an old forbidden book resting open across his knees, slowly beginning to understand that the poorest man in the kingdom might be standing at the edge of a truth powerful enough to shake Verith to its very foundations. The announcement came through official channels 3 weeks after the crash, delivered with the kind of ceremony the nobility reserved for events they wanted the whole kingdom watching. Tomas would compete in the Trial of Ascension, the ancient ritual competition meant to prove a bonded rider's worth before the entire court. No newly bonded rider had ever been forced into the trial without months of preparation. Most had years. Tomas was given 11 days. He learned about it not from any council member, but from a servant who slipped a folded notice under his door in the sanctuary, her hands shaking slightly as she did it. She did not stay to explain. She did not need to. Everyone in the palace understood what the council was doing, even if nobody dared say it aloud. They could not undo the bond. They could not simply remove him, so they would let the trial do it for them, and if he died in the process, no one could be blamed for a tradition older than the kingdom itself. Ril's response to the news was immediate and violent, a low growl building in her chest strong enough to rattle the sanctuary's stone walls. Tomas placed a hand against her scales, trying to calm her, though he felt just as unsettled underneath his calm expression. "We don't have a choice," he said quietly. "If I refuse, they'll say I was never worthy in the first place. If I run, they'll hunt us both down eventually. The only way through this is through it." He spent the following days doing what he had always done best, learning fast with almost nothing to work with. He had no trainer, no weapons master, no tutor sent to prepare him the way other candidates had been prepared since childhood. What he had was Ril, patient despite her fury, sharing fragments of memory and instinct through their bond, showing him how past riders had moved, how they had trusted their dragons in moments when trust was the only weapon that mattered. He also had years of experience that no noble child could claim. He knew how to move quickly through tight, dangerous spaces from years of scavenging in collapsing buildings. He knew how to read the exhaustion in another person's movements from watching desperate men fight over scraps in the slums. He knew how to keep going long after his body told him to stop, because stopping in the slums usually meant starving. The day of the trial arrived under a gray sky that seemed to match the mood of the crowd gathered in the arena, an enormous stone structure built centuries ago for exactly this kind of spectacle. Nobles filled the highest seats, dressed in colors bright enough to mock the dull, practical clothing Tomas still wore, refusing every offer of noble garments made for him. Below them, ordinary citizens packed the lower rings, and scattered among them, quiet and hopeful, were faces Tomas recognized from the slums, people who had heard the story and come to see if it was true. 6 other competitors stood across the arena floor, each one from a powerful noble house, each one trained since birth for exactly this moment. They looked at Tomas the way people look at something that does not belong, a stain on an otherwise polished floor. "This will not take long," said one of them, a broad young noble named Sarek, adjusting armor that gleamed with more decoration than function. "Try not to embarrass yourself too badly, beggar." Tomas said nothing. He had learned long ago that arguing with people who already believed themselves superior rarely changed anything. Better to let actions speak. The trial began with a horn blast that echoed across the arena, and the ground beneath them shifted, revealing a maze of collapsing platforms, narrow bridges, and pits filled with churning water below. The objective was simple in words and brutal in practice. Reach the flag mounted at the center of the arena before any other competitor, using whatever skill and bond strength each rider possessed, while the arena itself actively tried to kill them. The other competitors relied heavily on their dragons from the very start, letting raw power carry them across gaps and through obstacles, brute force replacing careful thought. Tomas, with Rill still healing from her injuries and unable to fly at full strength, could not afford the same approach. Instead, he moved the way he always had, calculating each step, testing each platform before trusting his full weight to it, reading the collapsing structure the way he once read the groaning warnings of buildings about to fall in on themselves. Sarek reached the halfway point first, laughing as he glanced back to see Tomas still navigating carefully near the start. "Told you," he shouted. "Some things can't be learned, only born." But Sarek's overconfidence became his undoing. He pushed his dragon too hard across an unstable bridge, and the structure gave way beneath them both, sending noble and dragon crashing into the water pits below, out of the competition entirely. 2 other competitors fell into similar traps, their reliance on strength alone blinding them to dangers a more careful eye would have noticed. Tomas continued moving steadily, Rill flying low beside him despite her pain, catching him during the moments his footing failed, trusting the bond between them more with every obstacle they cleared together. It was not fast, it was not flashy, but it was steady, and steady was something the other competitors, raised in comfort, had never truly needed to learn. By the time he reached the final stretch, only one competitor remained ahead of him, a skilled noblewoman named Aphra who had trained her entire life for this exact trial. She reached the flag first, her fingers brushing against the fabric. But Tomas, refusing to accept defeat after everything he had already survived, threw himself forward at the last possible moment, Rill surging beside him with the last burst of strength her healing body could offer, and his hand closed around the flagpole a fraction of a second before Aphra's grip tightened fully. The arena fell silent. Then, slowly, from the lower rings where the poor citizens sat, a cheer began to rise, growing louder, spreading upward through the crowd, until even some nobles found themselves reluctantly clapping, stunned by what they had just witnessed. The poorest man in the kingdom had done what no one believed possible. He had won. Victory should have quieted the whispers surrounding Tomas, but instead it multiplied them, turning simple gossip into something far more dangerous. A beggar winning the trial of ascension was not something the nobility could dismiss as luck or accident anymore. It demanded an explanation, and in a kingdom built on the belief that power belonged only to the worthy few, an explanation that made sense to everyone was hard to find. The old scholar, whose name was Yara, found herself at the center of this search. As the sanctuary's chief historian, she had spent decades studying dragon behavior, bonding patterns, and the ancient rituals surrounding them, always assuming the official records were complete. After witnessing Tomas's victory, she returned to the sanctuary's forbidden archive with a question she had never dared ask aloud before. What if the histories they had all been taught were incomplete on purpose? She found Tomas exactly where she expected, sitting beside Rill in the quiet hours after the trial's celebrations had died down, the old library book he had been reading weeks earlier still resting nearby. "You found the same fragments I did," Yara said, settling carefully onto a stone bench across from him, her joints protesting the movement. "The stories about early bonded pairs. Humans, not nobles." Tomas nodded slowly. "I didn't understand most of it. The language is old, but it kept mentioning something about will. Unbroken will." I don't know what that means exactly. Yara opened a leather satchel she had carried in, revealing several brittle scrolls she had risked her position to remove from the deepest section of the palace archive, sections technically forbidden to anyone without direct council approval. I've spent the last 2 weeks piecing together what remains of the true history, she said. It was not easy. Most of it was deliberately destroyed centuries ago, but not all of it. Someone, long ago, hid copies, hoping the truth would survive even if the originals did not. She spread the scrolls carefully across the stone floor between them, pointing to faded illustrations of dragons resting alongside simply dressed humans, images that looked nothing like the noble portraits filling the palace halls. Dragons do not choose based on wealth or bloodline, Yara explained. They never have. The bond forms around something much harder to fake, a kind of resilience that comes only from surviving hardship without losing your sense of self. The old texts call it unbroken will, the ability to endure suffering without becoming cruel because of it, without letting power, when it finally arrives, turn you into the same kind of monster that once hurt you. Tomas absorbed this in silence, his hand resting against Ril's scales as she listened as well, her presence steady beside him. For centuries, before the current ruling houses rose to power, Yara continued, humans were among the most commonly bonded partners dragons chose, specifically because human society at the time valued endurance and community over status. But when the ruling species began consolidating power, they realized something troubling. They could not force dragons to bond with whoever held the most political influence. Dragons chose based on character, not command. That posed a problem for a system built entirely on inherited privilege. So they changed the story, Tomas said quietly, understanding dawning in his voice. They rewrote the history, Yara confirmed. They created new rituals, new trials, all designed to filter candidates toward those already born into wealth, convincing themselves and everyone else that dragons naturally favored the noble class. They erased mention of humans almost entirely from official records, painting your people instead as simple laborers, unworthy of anything beyond service. It became easier to justify centuries of subjugation once everyone believed dragons themselves approved of the hierarchy. Ril's low growl rumbled through the room, and a wave of feeling pressed into Tomas's mind, something like old anger finally given permission to surface. He understood, without needing further explanation, that she remembered these events far more directly than any scroll could describe. My poverty wasn't something I overcame despite the odds, Tomas said slowly, piecing the truth together aloud. It's part of why she chose me. Not because I'm special, because I never had power handed to me. I never learned to take it for granted, or use it against anyone weaker than myself. Yara nodded. Exactly. The ruling houses have spent generations breeding comfort and entitlement into their bloodlines, believing it made them worthy. In truth, it may have done the opposite. This truth, once spoken aloud, proved impossible to contain. Word spread quietly through the sanctuary staff, then through servants, then through the lower districts where people had already begun treating Tomas's victory as a symbol of something greater than themselves. Within days, whispered versions of Yara's findings reached the ears of the council itself, and reactions split sharply along predictable lines. Some nobles, quietly uneasy about the foundations of their own status, wanted the matter buried entirely, the scrolls destroyed, Yara silenced through whatever means necessary. Others, sensing an opportunity to weaken rivals or gain favor among the increasingly restless human population, began asking louder questions in council chambers, forcing debates the ruling elders had avoided for centuries. Lord Havend, watching his authority slip through his fingers with every passing day, called a private meeting with a small circle of like-minded nobles, men and women who saw Tomas not as a curiosity to be managed, but as a direct threat to everything they had built their lives upon. If the people believe dragons choose based on character rather than blood, Havend said grimly to the gathered faces around him, they will begin asking why we hold power at all. This cannot be allowed to spread further. The trial was meant to eliminate him, muttered another noble. It failed. Havend's expression hardened into something colder, something more desperate. Then we will need a solution the dragon herself cannot interfere with. Outside the sealed meeting room, unaware of the plot forming against him. Tomas sat beneath the stars with Rill, finally beginning to understand not just why she had chosen him, but what that choice meant for a kingdom built entirely on a lie centuries in the making. The invitation arrived wrapped in gold thread, delivered by a servant whose eyes refused to meet Tomas's own, a small detail that struck him as wrong before he had even opened the seal. It requested his presence at a private ceremony, described as an honor bestowed upon exceptional bonded riders, meant to formally recognize his victory in the trial of ascension before select members of the court. No mention of Yara, no mention of Rill attending. That last detail alone was enough to make Tomas's stomach turn cold. He brought the invitation to Yara that evening, watching her expression shift from confusion to alarm as she read it twice over. "There is no ceremony like this in any record I've studied," she said quietly. "Riders are never separated from their dragons for official events. Never." Rill's reaction confirmed what neither of them wanted to say aloud. A wave of protective fury rolled through the bond the moment Tomas explained the invitation to her, powerful enough to rattle loose stones from the sanctuary ceiling. She refused, in every way her limited words and stronger feelings could express, to let him walk into that room alone. "If I don't go," Tomas said carefully, trying to reason with both her instinct and his own growing dread, "they'll say I'm hiding something, that I'm afraid to face the court. That gives them exactly the excuse they need to move against us both anyway. If I go and refuse to let you separate from me, at least they have to act in front of witnesses." It took hours of quiet argument, but eventually Rill agreed to remain nearby, hidden but within reach, breaking her promise the moment she sensed real danger, regardless of what any ceremony demanded. The private hall where the gathering took place was smaller than the Grand Council chamber, its stone walls thick enough to muffle sound from the outside world entirely. Only a dozen nobles stood waiting when Tomas arrived, led by Lord Havend himself, whose polite smile did nothing to hide the calculation behind his eyes. "Tomas," Havend said warmly, gesturing toward a raised platform at the center of the room. "Please, stand here. We have prepared something truly special to honor your unexpected achievement." Tomas remained still, scanning the room carefully, noting the armed guards positioned near each exit, the strange metal ring embedded into the floor of the platform, humming faintly with an energy he did not recognize but instinctively distrusted. "What is that?" he asked, nodding toward the ring. "A ceremonial artifact," Havend answered smoothly. "Ancient technology, capable of formally sealing a bond in the eyes of the kingdom. A great honor, reserved only for the most exceptional riders." Yara's earlier warnings echoed loudly in Tomas's memory. No such ceremony existed in any record she had studied. He understood immediately what the device likely was, not a tool of honor, but a weapon designed to sever the bond forcibly, something the council believed could finally solve their problem once and for all. "I think I'll decline," Tomas said calmly, taking a step back from the platform. Havend's expression darkened instantly, the mask of politeness falling away. "This was never truly a request," he said, nodding sharply toward the guards, who moved swiftly to seize Tomas and force him onto the platform despite his resistance. Rill felt it instantly. What followed was not calculated strategy or careful restraint. It was raw, protective fury unleashed without hesitation. The sanctuary walls, meant to contain even the largest dragons, shattered outward as she tore free, moving faster than her still healing body should have allowed, driven by something far stronger than pain. She reached the private hall within seconds, crashing through its thick stone walls as though they were made of paper, her roar shaking the very foundations of the palace itself. The guards, trained for many things but never for facing an enraged, fully awakened ancient dragon at point-blank range, scattered in terror. Havend stumbled backward, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by raw fear. The device beneath Tomas sparked violently before shattering entirely under a wave of energy Rill directed toward it with precise, controlled fury, freeing him from its pull instantly. He collapsed forward, gasping, the pain in his chest fading as quickly as it had come. "You erased history to protect your comfort," Tomas said, rising slowly to his feet as Rill positioned herself protectively beside him, her massive form filling most of the ruined hall. "You tried to kill us both rather than admit your entire world was built on a lie." Havend, cornered and desperate, opened his mouth to argue, but the arrival of additional council members, drawn by the destruction and Rill's earth-shaking roar, left no room left for denial. Yara arrived moments later as well, scrolls in hand, prepared to present undeniable proof before witnesses who could no longer look away from the truth. In the weeks that followed, the conspiracy unraveled entirely. Havind and his allies were stripped of their titles, their attempted assassination too public, too witnessed, too dangerous to quietly dismiss. The old, suppressed history of human and dragon partnerships spread rapidly through every level of Varith society, shaking a caste system built on generations of carefully maintained lies. Council members, eager to appear reasonable in the sudden shift of public opinion, offered Tomas noble status, wealth beyond anything he had ever imagined, a place among the very people who had once dismissed him as worthless. He refused, not out of pride, but because he understood, more clearly than anyone in that grand hall ever could, what real worth actually meant. Instead, he asked for resources to rebuild the slums, proper healers for the sick, fair wages for honest work, and a permanent seat at the council table reserved specifically for someone representing the human districts, ensuring voices like his would never again be silenced or forgotten. Months later, standing on a hill overlooking the slums where he had once scavenged for scraps just to survive, now bustling with new construction and cautious hope, Tomas rested a hand against Rill's healed wing as she settled beside him. Word of what happened in Varith had already begun spreading beyond the kingdom's borders, carried by trade ships and curious travelers to distant star systems, each retelling slightly different, but carrying the same unmistakable truth at its core. Humanity, once dismissed as weak, poor, and unworthy, had proven something no noble bloodline ever could. True strength was never about what you were born into. It was about what you refused to let yourself become, no matter how hard the world tried to break you.